Good morning. Bon matin. We'll ask you to take your seat, so we're going to start. We have to be on time for this session. So my name is Denis Prudhomme. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, as well as Vice President Research and the Scientific Director of the Montfort Institut de Savoir Montfort. I will co-chair this session with Ardern.
Hi, I'm Tarun Karapali. I'm the Associate Professor at the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan.
So this morning we have, the first speaker will be a personal perspective, and it will be followed up by three speakers. So I just want to remind you that there will be an Obesity Canada SNP reception. It will be at the General Governor Ballroom, and will be between 4:30 and 5:30, so you're all welcome to assist. So for now, I will let Ardern present the first speaker.
Our first speaker is Brendon Goodman. Brendon's a student at York University. He's looking forward to a career in politics and law, and he has been a lifelong advocate for people living with obesity. Please join me in welcoming Brendon.
Morning, everyone. I hope everyone is bright and ready for a morning of exciting presentations. As some of you have heard, I'm Brendon Goodman, and I'm a member of the Public Engagement Committee for Obesity Canada, and I've been with this wonderful organization since April of 2015. As a quick background, I have been overweight virtually my entire 24 years on this earth, and it's something I struggle with regularly. In my youth, I was carted around to what seemed like every damn dietitian and weight loss program in Toronto, with zero success, until I had joined the Sick Kids Team Obesity Management Program in Toronto, and they are known as STOMP. With them, I had found a healthier lifestyle and also received a sleeve gastrectomy at age 17 and had lost over 120 pounds. On that 17-year journey, I had faced many ups and downs in the medical system. From being told at 9 years old that I'll be dead at 30 if I keep up my old lifestyle, but to also making new friends and gaining new confidence through the STOMP program and through the weight loss. However, today I wanted to give a more personal perspective on the healthcare system and more on the day-to-day physical reality to living with obesity. For me, this is the most important. That doctor's visit when I was 9 and told I'll be dead at 30 was certainly horrible. However, it was merely one day in a whole lifetime. While the physical element of obesity is every second of every day and will always follow me out of the doctor's office. I wanted to start in a stage in life I'm sure many people in this room struggled with, and that was, of course, public school and the social septic tank that is school social life. I didn't have many, if any, friends in school, and one class that ensured it stayed that way was gym class. For most kids, gym class was the best day of the week, but for myself, it was hell. And that time of the week when the size difference between myself and my peers was most apparent. I was always picked last for dodgeball, yet always picked first to be a goalie in ball hockey due to my advanced width. The worst were activities were team-based exercises, where you went one at a time competing against groups of other kids. Inevitably, the group I was in would be dead last as I struggled to do the activities fast or timely, and would be then forced to finish them myself as the rest of the class, already done, all stared at me. As a kid, you get used to and accept this harsh reality, but as an adult, there has to be something better. So I'll give you two solutions that I was given in grade school. First was in grade 7. I had a gym teacher who was a very no-nonsense person, yet had a soft spot and strong social empathy. The gym teacher had never let me sit out of activities and not be part of the class, but would also not let other students treat me differently and would defer to my judgment if I thought it had been too much that day. On the other hand, my grade 8 gym teacher let me spend gym class on the bench, sitting down, doing nothing, which for 13-year-old me was the best solution possible. Which approach is better, I can't say for sure. However, both are far superior to the system I was subjected to for most of public school. Luckily, in high school, gym class became an option, and I dropped it faster than Usain Bolt. However, the other biggest obstacle in my life is cities. To be blunt, cities are not made for the obese. They are massive concrete jungles bereft of proper public seating, uneven pavement, and a lack of mobility if one needs to use a car or a scooter to get around. You see this reflected in the people who live in urban centers. You'll be hard-pressed to see many, if any, obese people living in downtown Toronto or New York City. And I can tell you with certainty, as someone who lives in Toronto and who has visited New York City twice, in both cities, you walk downtown and you stick out like a sore thumb and feel like you simply don't belong. When we took 2 family trips in New York City, I loved seeing the city and experiencing all it had to offer. I did not know something larger and more grandiose than Toronto, the center of the universe, could exist. It was one of my most memorable trips, and yet the one I hated the most. As you remember, New York ain't for the obese. And if you think Toronto or Ottawa traffic is bad, you haven't seen New York City, where driving simply isn't an option if you plan to do anything that day. And to us Torontonians, where the subway is 3 straight lines, the New York City one was too daunting for us transit simpletons. So we walked everywhere in the 40-degree New York heat. I never pushed myself far physically as I did that summer. I even recall one evening walking back to our hotel after a long day and almost passing out from heat and exhaustion. I now try to avoid traveling to cities as bad as New York City on trips, and that's simply because the reality of obesity means I cannot enjoy it. Even here in Ottawa, if I wanted to visit our nation's House of Government just across the street from us, I would have to stand in a 40-minute security line that these legs of mine would struggle to stand in line for so long. And I can tell you from experience that our lawmakers have little respite for the disabled of all stripes in accessing Parliament. And yet I still persevered in New York City, and I walked further than anyone could think, an obese teenager, and I still never let my physical hindrances get in the way of my passions in life. One of those is also playing paintball, which is a very physically demanding sport as you run around a grass field, hiding behind cover and shooting paintballs at one another. For me, the fun of the moment overrides my legs telling me they want to explode. I even recall one day when I brought my healthy-looking friend along and I ran circles around him and lasted far longer into our day of paintball than he had done. But what's the point? What are all the takeaways in all this? With my experiences in hand, I can tell you there needs to be a change in how gym class is run in our public schools. It was a big reason why I had run for school board trustee in our recent municipal elections. We wouldn't force a student in a wheelchair to do all the gym activities, yet it's still socially acceptable to force an obese kid to perform social suicide every week and flounder in gym class. As well, our cities need to be made more accessible and accessible to people of all backgrounds. I sit on the Accessibility Advisory Committee for my local municipality, and along with myself and 10 other members, we work towards making it a more accessible place, not just for the obese, but for people of all kinds of adverse conditions in life. And finally, if we want overweight people to get out and move more, we need to end shaming of those who try to better themselves. If I was a bit more tech savvy, I could show you a bevy of tweets and pictures of those being shamed for daring to be both overweight and in a gym. When even the spot where society tells us overweight people should be, in a gym, we still have similar harassment and discrimination and ostracization that I may have felt in school or walking down Times Square in New York. But I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me babble on for 10 minutes about gym class and walking downtown. But most importantly, though, I hope this gives you some insights on the physical and personal reality, the relationship the obese have with physical activity. Thank you.
was a really interesting perspective, Brendon. Do we have any questions for Brendon at this point? No questions? Okay, I have a question, I suppose. So as a politician, what would be the first thing that you'd do to improve accessibility?
The first thing I would definitely do is try and initialize a program to be more inclusive and to, especially if we're talking from a schooling perspective, one of the things I'd want to do if I, as trustee, is create initiatives to tell kids, educate people about obesity, how it works, because to a kid they just see another person that's larger than them and hence something to make fun of. So you need to we received education in public school about how you shouldn't make fun of the disabled or anyone different than you, but I think there needs to be more specific education towards those living with obesity and those with the size difference.
Thank you very much, Brendon. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Tremblay, who is the Director of Healthy Active Living and Obesity Research at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute and a Professor of Pediatrics in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tremblay.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here in Ottawa. So, how's everyone's NHL bracket predictions going? Yeah, interesting reading the hockey news each morning. Anyways, I'm here not to talk about obesity per se, but to talk about healthy active living, which I believe is well, frankly, more important, regardless of size. And specifically, I'm here to talk about the importance of the whole day from a movement perspective. I don't have the slides to see here, do I? No? I've got to look around? Okay. Next slide. So, do I have a flicker? No? Okay. Anyways, I'll just ask for next slide, please. These are my disclosures. I've received travel and funding from a lot of different agencies. Next slide. So I think each of us know, and thanks, I've got the screen up here now. Each of us know that sleep is important for health. Increasingly in the literature, we're finding out that sedentary behavior, sedentary time is important to health. We know that physical activity is important for health. All right. But interestingly enough, in the movement world at least, we deal with each of these issues in complete isolation. Next slide, or next button. Yet we know there's an interaction between sleep and physical activity, for example, and all of the different combinations. There we go. All right, thanks. Such that if we get a terrible night's sleep and we do our workout the next day, in all likelihood, the physical and emotional benefits are going to be mitigated, right? And you can see each of these combinations. And that actually is pathetically obvious and bears out in the literature. And so just as an example here, and by the way, I'm gonna talk mostly about kids here, but the analogies are all the same to adults and older adults. And I'm gonna bounce back between infants and toddlers and school-age children because the concepts I'm trying to get across are universal. So for an infant, some physical activity like this is good. And so the check mark gives you an indication that this has positive benefits, probably to the bone, to the muscles, to the brain of the child. But if they get that activity and they have excessive screen time, just as an example, you could use the analogy of sleep as well, then perhaps the benefit is mitigated, right? This seems fairly straightforward. And so the point is that the whole day matters. Across this whole continuum of things, each of these various components on the movement continuum are interacting and influencing one another. More of this might influence more of that. If I want more time for this, I have to take it from that. What are the trade-offs and so on? And while diet and Energy In has understood this since the beginning, us exercise scientists are a little bit slower on the uptake. Let me just give an example so you understand what I'm saying. Is this an active day in the life of a child? You drive your grade 3 kid to school. They're in the car for, let's say, 30 minutes, being dropped off. Probably faster to walk in most circumstances. They sit in school all day, maybe get a little bit of activity at recess, take the bus home, need to stay inside after school because it's dangerous outside. They do something similar in the evening. But then they have soccer practice for 45 minutes, of which they're probably active for 11 minutes. But from an epidemiologic perspective, this is an active day. They've achieved 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity if you add the 15 and the 45. And so that particular child, for any analytical purposes, is in the active group. Now, if you look at this, you say, but they hardly did anything all day. Well, that is what our guidelines of the past have told people to do. Get your 60 minutes of MVPA. The rest of the day doesn't matter. The other 23 hours of the day doesn't matter. And of course it does. So we began a process in Canada, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years ago, to start to explore with some vigor, looking at the whole day from a movement perspective, including the absence of movement. And so we followed the gold standard guideline development process that were published in this citation. It's available for you all to look at and criticize or learn from. And we began this process, the first country in the world to develop 24-hour movement guidelines, to evolve from physical activity guidelines. Get your exercise, 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, or in the case of adults, 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. But let's think about the whole day, and what are the trade-offs like? And what about someone that doesn't want to do moderate to vigorous physical activity? Do we just ignore them, or are there other things we can do for them? And so we began the process first focusing on school-age children and youth, and that was the first one. And we developed 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth aged 5 to 17, and those were released in June of 2016, the first in the world. We then moved down to the younger ages and dealt with the 0 to 4 group separately for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, and those were released in November of 2017. To finish off the full age spectrum, the adults and older adult guideline development is underway, probably halfway through, with an anticipation release of maybe a year from now, something like that. So just park that. In the development of the guidelines, we followed the gold standard process for developing guidelines, transparent, open, assessed by independent methodologists. We conducted systematic reviews for relationship between physical activity and health, sedentary time and health, sleep and health, and then various combinations of those behaviors and health. And we also completed some compositional analyses, which I'll talk about briefly. So again, there's different age groups here, and so I'm kind of blending things together. But in general, the systematic reviews were comprehensive. They looked at everything that the end user told us was important to them from a health outcome. So you see measures of fitness, adiposity, growth in the case of the kids, psychosocial health, emotional development, cognitive development, and so on. Okay, the point here is that we did a very comprehensive assessment of the literature. Did we look at absolutely everything? No. We did not specifically look at asthma, for example. But we did many such that the evidence was coalescing and feeding into the guidelines that resulted. We also, I don't know if you noticed there, we also looked in the opposite direction. We looked at potential harms. So if you increase physical activity, is there more harm because a child might twist their ankle than the benefit to their muscles or bones, for example? So then we also had the compositional analyses, which many people will perhaps not be familiar with. And so this is an analytical method that allows us to look at the composition of the movement behaviors of the day. So how much sedentary time, how much physical activity time, how much sleep, and the various conformities of that, which of course are constrained into the 24-hour period. You can't expand them. They're gives and takes, right? So if I tell you to sleep 30 minutes more per night, you say, okay, I'm going to exercise 30 minutes less. Okay, so the impact of that might be different than if you watch TV 30 minutes less, right? And those are the gives and takes. So compositional analysis allows us to do that. So it examines the relationships among the movement behaviors and a health indicator. In this particular analysis, and this was for school-age children and youth that I'm showing you here, but we did it for early years as well, and we have already done it and published for adults and older adults. So these were using data from the Canadian Health Measures Survey, a little over 4,000 kids, nationally representative, school-aged, cycles 1 to 3 of the CHMS. Most of the measures were objectively measured with accelerometry, except sleep, which was subjectively measured. And we were able, because the CHMS collects biospecimens, we're able to look at a lot of very rich, very rigorously measured indicators. You can see the list here. Some psychosocial indicators, some anthropometric indicators, some biospecimen biomarkers. And so just for your information, a school-aged child spends about 40 minutes of their day asleep, or 40% of the day asleep, about 40% sedentary, and about 20% active, of which only a little sliver is exercise or moderate to vigorous physical activity, 4%, which in the past, just to drive this point home, is all we focused on. That's all we cared about. The other 96% there, yeah, whatever, as long as you get your exercise. And this isn't to diminish the importance of exercise, and I'll show in the next slide. It's the most important thing from a per-minute perspective, but it isn't the only thing, nor is it the only entry point to try and improve health. So the findings from this compositional analysis is that the composition matters, that for every indicator, the composition, the conformity of those different behaviors within the 24-hour period was significantly related to every single health outcome. Differentially, though, some in a very unimportant way, as low as 1%, and when you've got 4,200 people, it's not that hard to get your p-values below 0.05. But some rather significantly, 44% of the variance explained. So the whole day matters. But MVPA is the major driver. So per minute, so if you had only 1 minute to cash in, taking sedentary time and making it MVPA is the best bang for your buck. But it's not the only bang for the buck. Okay? There are other trade-offs that are there, so the whole day matters. The findings highlight the importance of MVPA particularly, but that the whole day matters. There are other benefits that can be achieved. There are additional benefits that can be achieved even if you meet your MVPA guidelines. The whole day matters. So as we were developing these guidelines, and these are, and I'm an exercise physiologist, you know, grown up to be very protective of exercise. Exercise is all that matters. Well, it's not all that matters. It's very important. But it's something that almost universally we don't do. And even those of us that do it for 2, 3, 4% of our 24-hour period. Okay? So when we developed these guidelines, we were very conscious of going out to the stakeholders, to experts, people beyond our field to say, what do you think? How palatable are these? Are they comprehensible, and so on? So we did a stakeholder survey, and again, depending on the age group, 500 to 1,000 stakeholders, with draft guidelines to say, what do you think? Do these make sense? Are they understandable? Do you agree with them? We also held focus groups across the country in English and in French with different focus groups with parents, with youth, with pediatricians, with phys ed teachers, and we did key informant interviews. These are all published and available in the case of the early years in this manuscript, in the case of the school-age children in another one. Pretty easily obtained if you do a Google search. And so anyways, we had this evidence that in this case of children and youth, 4 systematic reviews. In the case of adults and older adults, many, many more. We did compositional analyses. We had expert consensus from an international expert panel, stakeholder feedback from over 1,000 people across the country, and methodological advice from independent methodologists that were examining the transparency and the appropriateness of our methodology. And this produced the foundation of evidence, and we published all of that for people to assess what we did. And because we were going a completely new route, we spent a fair bit of time a priori in developing the way that we would present this. So we developed a visual identity I'll show you in a minute, and it's on your tables, public-facing tools, implementation and activation things, and so on. And so on many of the tables, you'll have a little pamphlet thing. It might be from the early years, it might be from children and youth. I'll explain the difference. It might be in English, it might be in French, depending on which table you're at. Those are for you to take home. And so this is the visual identity for children and youth, school-age children and youth. It includes the iconography. Hopefully when you look at this, what do you see? Someone yell out. No, okay, you see a 4. Some people don't see a 4. Some people see a bar graph, and I still not sure what's wrong with those people. But the fact that you see a 4 is good. It's supposed to be a 4. And without any further information, it's supposed to be your signal, oh yeah, I'm supposed to live a healthy day. Okay? And why a 4? Because it represents, in this case, the 4 speeds of childhood. And we developed alliteration on purpose for this. Sweat, step, sleep, and sit. Sweat, step, sleep, and sit. Those are the 4 speeds of childhood. And of course, there's specific recommendations there, and they're on the pamphlet that you have on your table, so I probably won't use up my time in the next slide to go through each of those. Sweat, step, sleep, and sit. And so they're there, and in very rough approximations, they're there in the proportion that you should be getting them. So you want to get some, and by sweat, we mean moderate to vigorous physical activity, right? This is the exercise portion. So that's down there in green, a little bit of that each day. Line sloping up, more is better. And that goes into step, which represents your light physical activity, the incidental stuff you do. Lots more of that, should be plenty of that throughout the day. More is better, line going up. The biggest chunk, of course, is sleep. Not enough isn't good, so you want more. Too much probably isn't good, and so you see the sort of peak up there. And then on the other side is screen time, which should be very low, and less is better, sloping down. So all that messaging is there without even having the guideline. You might not know it's 60 minutes of sweat per day that you're supposed to get and X number of hours of this and whatever. But just seeing that, yeah, that's the healthy day message. I'm supposed to get a good night's sleep and get some activity or something like that. If that's all we get across, we've achieved our goal. We're going to use different variations of this same thing for the different age groups. So here's the one for early years, because the concept of sweating for an infant isn't really appropriate. And so we've combined those first two into just move. We want young children to move a lot. Some should be at higher intensity, some at lower intensity, and so on. But that all gets kind of clumped together, and the rest of it is the same. I suspect when we complete the adults and older adults, we'll have 2 more versions of the 4. The 4 speeds of adulthood, or the 4 speeds of older adulthood, or whatever it might look like. Okay? And we've done a number of things to implement, disseminate, and activate these. We've had a proactive media relations outreach campaign for the release of both the early years and the children and youth, school-age children and youth. We will do similar for the adults and older adults. Distribution of guideline-related materials through our networks, including like I just did this morning. There was a cross-Canada lecture tour, at least for the early years. All the promotional materials are available in English and French at the website that you see there. You can order them, you can download them, print them. There are tear sheets, webinars, a glossary of terms, guideline development report, press release, all the background, the history of this, and so on. More information than you'd ever really want to know about this. All part of the transparent process about how we developed it. We also developed, for school-age children and youth, Build Your Best Day, an interactive website experience that helps to teach kids the importance of trade-offs. That if you do more of this, you do it at the expense of something else. What should it be? There's probably better and worse decisions associated with that. I welcome you to go to the Build Your Best Day website if you're interested. And in the case of the early years, we published 13 manuscripts on all of the background information. So this is the actual guidelines for children and youth, the 4 speeds of childhood. I won't spend the time going through them, but it's all there, and it tells you what a healthy day looks like. It also ends with a trade-off message that, okay, here are the guidelines. Get 60 minutes or moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. Depending on your age, get 9 to 11 or 8 to 10 hours of sleep per day. Limit your screen time to no more than 2 hours per day. The rest should be a whole bunch of light physical activity. That's basically what the stuff I flicked through. But it also says, okay, if you can make those, or even if you can't, the trade-offs you should do is first start with a healthy night's sleep, so you wake up refreshed and so on. And if you can, throughout the day, trade off sedentary behavior or even light activity for MVPA. Biggest bang for the buck comes from the MVPA. Also, if you can trade off indoor time for outdoor time, that's a good thing. If you can limit extended sitting, that's a good thing. okay, within your own confines. So there's a number of entry points, especially in the context of obesity and trying to introduce healthy active living to a more challenging obese patient. There's lots of it. You don't have to tell them again, you know, they need to exercise more. You could start perhaps with saying, do you have screens in your bedroom when you go to sleep? Yes, I do. Can I challenge you for a week to keep them out of your bedroom? With the hope that perhaps they'll have a little bit better quality sleep, that they'll wake up in the morning a little bit more refreshed, that might tempt them to take the dog for a longer walk in the evening. And that's your entry point, all right? So that's the idea. This is what they actually look like if you order the tear sheets. These are the ones for the early years. It's a little bit simpler for school-age kids because it doesn't have to be broken down by infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, but the specific guidelines are there. So the clinicians in the group, you can order these from the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology and give them out, or give the website out to your folks. So what can you do? You can help by becoming familiar with this, read the background materials, master the content, and even if you can't, just know the four. Talk to the people about the four speeds of childhood. Disseminate the guidelines if you can. Link the guidelines on your website. Promote them through communication activities, workshops, staff updates, and so on. Support efforts by others to implement the guidelines into childcare settings, into school settings, into clinical settings. Reduce sedentary time and programming activities for those of you that are more in the recreation and fitness world. Make sure children of all abilities are included. These apply to children of all abilities. And by the way, there's a separate, an excellent document, a toolkit, specifically for how you would implement these guidelines for children with a disability, available in both languages, again on the CSEP website. I didn't bring some of those, I apologize. Emphasize the physical literacy building blocks. Encourage people to be active with their children. Be a good role model yourself. Second last slide. So you could think that this is just a bit of a cult that has started in Canada. Maybe that's the case, except the rest of the world is buying into it. So since we started developing these guidelines, New Zealand has released 24-hour movement guidelines for early years in children and youth. Australia sat right on our coattail and copied the development of our 24-hour guidelines for the early years, and their government has officially released Australian 24-hour movement guidelines for the early years, and 2 weeks ago released 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth based on our background research. Same has happened in South Africa for the early years. This that you're seeing on the screen here, less than 24 hours ago, was released by the World Health Organization, Guidelines on Physical Activity, Sedentary Behavior, and Sleep for children under 5 years of age. These are modeled after, essentially copied, from the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth. So we now have global recommendations that the whole day matters, healthy sleep, healthy sitting, healthy movement behaviors, and that's available for you to go and download and see as well. So in conclusion, 24-hour guidelines represent a new paradigm in understanding the health effects of movement behaviors. The whole day matters. Children need to sweat, step, sleep, and sit the right amounts for optimal health. A year from now, I'm pretty sure my concluding slide for adults and older adults will be exactly the same. It's important for us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark, for this excellent presentation. We have probably time for one or two questions. So, Mark, maybe you did focus group with adolescents about the format of the messaging and how it was received by them.
We did a lot of focus groups, like 20 or so across the country, again in both languages, but stratified. And there was universal support for the integration of the guidelines. This just makes sense to everyone, except us exercise physiologists initially, you know. And everyone was supportive except youth. And it's not that they weren't supportive. They just said they won't pay attention really no matter what the advice is. They're going to do what they're going to do. I mean, they were very candid that way. So it's not that they disagreed with it or they didn't think, yes, this is, you know, done correctly and it doesn't make sense to do it. But they were very candid that, you know, they're going to live their life the way they're going to live their life. And if the doctor tells them to get more sleep, that may or may not happen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Chris Arden. He's a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Science at York University. He's also an affiliate investigator at the Salt Lake Regional Health Center. His primary research interests include epidemiology of physical activity, obesity, and cardiovascular risk.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for the invitation. It is a tough act to follow, Mark and Brendon there, but lots of food for thought and certainly things that we can all incorporate. I want to begin by just acknowledging some of my collaborators, in particular Jennifer Cook and all of the SNPs trainees at York and beyond who've been involved in this work and really did all the heavy lifting on this. So what I'm going to do is provide a bit of an epidemiological operationalization of metabolically healthy and unhealthy obese phenotypes. I'm going to describe patterns of movement behaviors, some of which allude to what Mark just spoke about, and then provide some preliminary analysis that explore variation in the development and maintenance of metabolic health, leading to the impact or the contribution of physical activity. I just want to highlight that when we think about the complexity of obesity, our lab at York University is very much reliant on population health survey, sometimes accelerometer data, and administrative data. And so what we're doing in the activity spectrum represents only a very small segment or small piece of the overall puzzle that's extremely complex. But I don't need to tell anyone in this room that we've been incredibly successful over the years in terms of the society engineering ways to be active out of our daily lives. And this is just a visualization here from Kopkin, looking at some of the time use data over time, 50 years or so, where we see a shift away of movement across the globe in terms of average met hours per week spent in all physical activity domains. And you also see a concomitant increase in terms of the average hours per week that individuals are sedentary. Now, at the same time, or in line with that, over the past 20 years or so, certainly where we've had better surveillance and measured BMI data and waist circumference, we've seen more of a twofold increase in the prevalence of obesity in Canada, and at the extremes, and certainly in terms of class 2 and 3 obesity, it's increased 3 to 4-fold. And so when you put it together, you start to think about the health-related complications and the tip of the iceberg that we might be setting ourselves up for. And this has been characterized, well, many decades ago. And here, in terms of the hypertriglyceridemic waist by Dupree and others, and as we often use the metabolic syndrome today, as factors that tend to co-occur together more frequently in individuals with excess adiposity or elevated waist circumference. And so that's really what I'm going to spend time talking about today, is that specific case, but also acknowledging that the lived experience with obesity is much more than that. So what I'm just doing here on this first slide is showing you some older data, some NHANES data that we published in 2010 that looks at the different clustering that occurs across age and sex and the differential rates of mortality associated with it. And you can see I've just cross-classified all of the different ways, 16 different ways that a person could be classified with a metabolic syndrome according to NSEP criteria. And I guess I just want you to focus more down below where I got the cutoff of that arbitrary general garden variety waist circumference threshold here, and looking at this Venn diagram in terms of the different components that tend to cluster together. So you will notice that with extra or higher levels of waist circumference, you do tend to see more risk factor clustering. But I just want to point out that about a third of individuals in this group, if not more, do not have any of the identified risk factors. And that's really what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. And we've been interested in this for some time. And on the left, you're looking at some data run by in NHANES by Banaz Al-Khalidi, a PhD student of mine, a year or so ago. And this is a lifetime risk assessment where you're looking at the number of risk factors and the cumulative risk of cardiometabolic death. And on the right, you're looking at an additional merged data set of 4 cohorts tracked over time, where you've cross-classified people based on their waist circumference levels, so preclinical, slightly elevated, and abdominal obesity levels of 88 centimeters and 102 in women and men respectively. And the take-home here is simply that you don't see any demonstrable risk or elevated risk of mortality in those who have elevated waist circumference, but no other metabolic risk factors. And you can see that elaboration here on the left in another analysis by Banaz, where we actually see a clear separation in terms of the metabolically healthy obese and unhealthy obese phenotypes. And so there is some controversy in the area in terms of what these definitions should be. The one that we've adopted for our analysis is, again, elevated waist circumference or BMI in the absence of traditional cardiometabolic risk. So when we take that lens and we go back through looking at measured BMI over the last sort of 15 years or so in US and in Canada, and we actually look at the MHO, or metabolically healthy obese phenotype, you see that represents about 8% of the US population here. And it's varied to some degree year by year, a little bit of noise in there, but it's about 21% or so of the total quote-unquote obese sample in the US. And we know that through some gold standard studies from Bob Ross at Queen's and others that the pathways in maintaining or improving obesity-related health risks do not necessarily have to include changes in BMI or waist circumference. Certainly we see improvements in metabolic health through improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness and changes in visceral adipose tissue. Okay, so what I want to do in the next couple of slides is just give you a little bit of a taste for some of the cross-sectional evidence, some of the relationships that Mark spoke about, and a profile of movement behaviors in these two groups of metabolically healthy and unhealthy obese. So here we're looking in NHANES simply at hours of sleep per day. We don't see much difference between MHO and MUO, and certainly in terms of TV times, about 3 hours in each group, and these are adults, I should say, exclusively. And for sedentary time, about 7 hours per day. And when you actually apply the cutoffs that we typically see in the literature in these mosaic plots here, and you compare them side by side, a few differences do begin to emerge when we look at physical activity prevalences. So this is meeting the MVPA guidelines, higher rates in MUO groups. When we look at high TV time and fairly low threshold of 3 hours per day, but it seems to be higher in MUO. No real difference in sedentary time. Set at 7 hours per day, and in poor sleep, that's the prevalence less than 6 hours or more than 9 hours per day. Recently, we've also explored this and extended this into a collaboration we've got at South Lake Regional Health Center in the microvascular population, just to see what's going on there. And so this is syndrome XY, Takotsubo disease. And what we actually see there is about 50% of individuals living with obesity are classified by the number in terms of obesity are metabolically healthy. Okay? And when we look at, again, movement patterns here, we see some differences in terms of screen time, sitting time, and MVPA guideline adherence. So a poorer profile movement time in general with MUO, again, to no one's surprise here. But when we start to look at sleep, no real differences in terms of the quantity or duration of sleep, but we do see differences in terms of the quality, and that was measured simply by a questionnaire in terms of fatigue experience during the day, and also in terms of a composite stop-bang criteria, which is used as a way to refer patients for sleep lab. When we extend this, we actually look in more finite or refined polysomnography in the sleep heart health survey data. what we see is that there is also a differentiation in terms of the amount of time spent in REM sleep, specifically stage 3 sleep. We see MOU spend more time in hypopnea during sleep or experience more episodes. And in general, MUO has more wake after sleep onset. So again, sleep efficiency, sleep quality is poor overall. So I just want to comment now in terms of the spectrum or the cross classifications of sedentary time and physical activity, as Mark alluded to, that these things do not occur in isolation and that we all share the same 24 hours or course of the day. What you're looking at now is Canadian Health Measures Survey, but fully adjusted analysis where we cross-classified people, and it doesn't matter if you're looking at BMI, classification of obesity or abdominal waist circumference obesity. You see that inactivity or sedentary time and moderate to vigorous activity both have an impact and a joint effect. And similarly, shifting over to some adjusted analysis in NHANES, when we simply ask people about their difficulty in sleep, the quality of sleep overall, we see significant relationships that are independent of leisure time, physical activity with MHU. So we've been tackling this question not through compositional analysis or isotemporal substitutions, as Mark and others have done so much, but through some mediation, moderation analyses. And Thiro Kanegasabe, a former PhD student now in global health at McGill, has really done the heavy lifting on a lot of this work. And this is difficult work to really summarize, but what I'm showing here is just sort of a directed, acyclical, kind of causal inference graph where we're looking at the relationship between sleep duration or quality and various metabolic risk factors as outcomes, and seeing whether or not sedentary activity, lifestyle activity, moderate vigorous activity, how that mediates or changes that relationship that goes directly from sleep duration or quality to cardiometabolic health. The take home here is simply that, of course, as Mark's already said, these are interrelated factors. If you have a poor sleep, you're going to have, you're not going to reap the benefits of your workout, and in particular, lifestyle-related activity and moderate activity had the largest effects on sleep duration or quality. Okay, and so this is just, again, hearkening back to the interaction effects here. Again, looking at Sleep Heart Health Survey data, again by Thiro, we look at 4-year change scores in sleep time and sleep quality in terms of sleep efficiency, and look at changes. And we actually don't see much of an impact in terms of changes in sleep and changes in obesity, but again, there's a lot of other things that aren't accounted for. These are not adjusted for physical activity at all. So then, knowing that total physical activity, recreational physical activity is of course important in defining this MHO phenotype, we started to explore this a little bit further and became interested in concerned about the possible contribution of starting weight cycling, and duration of obesity over time on these relationships. And that's really what you're looking at here. The main message is that we think that the previous weight is important in these relationships and the contribution of activity and frankly, maybe some of the other interactions to MHO status. And this has been explored to some degree, or is nicely visually shown here in a graph from Jennifer Cook and Sean Wharton. This is Wharton Medical Clinic patients. And this is just simply showing, again, what we already know, that obesity is a complex, relapsing, progressive disease, and the experience from one person to another in terms of their weight loss journey varies quite considerably. And so when we've gone back and looked at Women's Health Initiative data and sort of cross-classified people based on their weight cycling status, of course, we see differences in body composition, that is, whole body percent fat for a given anthropometric measure, be it BMI or waist circumference. And it's telling that when we look at the mode of weight loss attempts in these groups, those who are successful weight loss maintainers may simply be more able or have fewer barriers to being physically active. I mean, we see some differences in terms of weight cyclers using more commercial programs, dieting pills, but in terms of those who are able to maintain their weight, the successful weight loss maintainers are more active in general and have better body composition. So this is part of an overall package that got us thinking again about sort of the longer term trajectories and opportunities for early intervention to delay the transition between MHO and MUO, specifically in the development of obesity. And so keep in mind this is epidemiological, sort of broad strokes data, and these are models that are drawn from or borrowed from aspects of psychology and criminology that allow us to apply Bayesian statistics and really look at group-based trajectories or commonalities. Okay, so basically we throw in our data and we model it, look for the best fit, and then go back and try and predict or look at the group membership characteristics. And what you see in this example, this is modeling obesity development in people who were of average BMI starting point from Cardia and this is sort of 25 to 40-year-old individuals. And you're looking at the probability of obesity development, and the red curve and the green line clearly jump out. And you can see that those higher trajectory groups were observed to have some different characteristics. I'm not listing them all in terms of their sociodemographic, medical characteristics, but they did tend to be comprised of individuals who have lower physical activity levels. And we can replicate that analysis and now including individuals of higher weights and just looking at the gains in BMI or waist circumference over time. And again, here what you see focusing on the activity is that higher levels or higher intensity activity is associated with lower trajectories. And again, not surprising if we want to extend this to clinical decision risk tools and look at this over 20 years of follow-up, we see EOS staging, so that's physical, functional, mental health complications increase over the same period of time. We see increases in metabolic syndrome, and we see Framingham risk scores increase across the board and to a greater degree in those with living with obesity. So when we model the metabolic outcomes across the obese groups, what we see is actually 5 groups emerge, or 5 distinct patterns. Again, this is broad swaths, but you can look at for the individual characteristics that we're typically interested in for the metabolic syndrome. And here it is for the overall groups. And the only thing that I'll point out here or highlight is simply that these are, if we look at the green and the black groups, it represents about 23% of the cardia sample as a whole. And I think that first sort of 8 years or so on that curve, where you see the highest slope or asymptote, is an opportunity, a window of opportunity for more aggressive management. So if we can identify individuals who follow certain trajectories earlier, it might give us some additional opportunities. And as I've said already, we don't have good measures here of sleep, of sedentary time. We're currently working on a data harmonization across many NIH studies where we can look at changes in these things over time, but I'll simply point out that over that 20-year period, this is important in the sense that those 2 upper groups, the moderate and high groups here, 1 in 10 to 1 in 4 develop diabetes over that period of time. Essentially, 40 to 85% of them developed metabolic syndrome, and we did see differences in terms of physical activity levels. In summary, I guess this is just a bit of an overview of movement behaviors, and I think some evidence that of course we're talking about a very heterogeneous and bidirectional relationships. In terms of the trajectory analyses, these are exploratory, but they do suggest some distinct patterns of obesity-related health risk development and maintenance. And again, we're working right now to drill down on this quite a bit more specifically, to merge more data and to look at more discrete time periods to look at changes in this over time. So I think that's my time, so I will stop there.
Thank you, Chris, for this excellent presentation. Any question, comment from the room? GP?
Yes. Jean-Philippe Chaput, Ottawa. Thank you very much, Chris, for a very good presentation. Quick question. So when we look at the relationships between movement behaviors and body weight or cardiometabolic risk, rarely we include diet in our analysis. I do that for different good reasons. Either diet is not available, we don't trust the data, and so on. So how much noise do we have in our findings by not having a good measurements of the diet, given the well-known association between diet and body weight and CVD risk factors?
Yeah, and I mean, we've played around with that a little bit, and I think you can answer this better than I can. You know, the simple answer is, I think, a lot. You know, the measures that we have, I mean, certainly what I've shown, the measures of activity, we have a lot of noise in, but certainly in diet, we, as physical activity researchers, we treat it as a confounder, as something we don't want to touch, or maybe we're not prepared to properly deal with. So I have to acknowledge that, and that this is very limited in that sense. So I'm open to anyone's suggestions about how we can better address this. Yeah.
Any more questions? Cannot see over there. Okay. Well, thank you, Chris. So it's my pleasure to present Dr. Joanne Gilbert, work at the University of Montreal and also founder of Imparfait et en Santé, where she helped people who are concerned about improving their overall health to find a personalized and enjoyable solution to manage their weight. So please join Joanne Gilbert.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about barriers to physical activity. Of course, there are great guidelines for us, but we know that many people do not exercise as much as they should. And because of this cold right now, I'm not exercising as much as I could, so maybe you also have your own barriers to physical activity. And in my practice, and also in the research I'm still involved in, I see that people living with obesity, they have their specific barriers to physical activity, and I think it's important for researchers, health professionals, and also policymakers to not only recognize, know them, but also address these barriers to physical activity. How does that work? I guess that's the big nope. Not this one either. How does that work? So it works. Great. Thank you. Okay. So the concept of behavioral barriers to physical activities has been studied for many years. And as I said, we know that when the barriers are overcome, like we reduce the number of barriers, of course, the physical activity behavior will increase. So when I thought I knew a lot about the barriers to physical activity, and when I started digging to prepare this presentation, I realized that, well, that was quite a humbling experience. In many aspects, we can find barriers of physical activity, so I'm going to concentrate my talk on individual biological and psychological barriers to physical activity. This is more my field. And barriers can be also faced in many phases in lifetime. There's not that much evidence on children and adolescents. Unfortunately, most of the evidence that I found were on adults. And I've added, on top of this bar that you can see on the life stages, I've added one life stages that people living with obesity can face is massive weight loss after, for instance, bariatric surgery. I'm going to talk about this too. So, barriers can come from, barriers can be biological. Of course, the individual differences in physical activity behavior is clear, and there are biologic and genetic mechanisms that are responsible for that. This recent research on the genetics of the barriers to physical activity has been published recently, and there are 3 sites that are influenced by genetics, that are brain, the cardiorespiratory system, and the muscles. So I'm not saying that when we have in front of us a person living with obesity, that necessarily there's some genetic, that the reason why the person is not as active as the person should be, it's not necessarily because of the genetic, but we have to keep in mind that there are genetic aspects of physical activity behavior, even in the motivation aspects. So this have to be kept in mind. Regardless of the source of the barrier, like saying, hello, how are you? Thank you very much. And I have to now. Perfect. Okay. So regardless if the barriers are biological or psychological, this study synthesized all the barriers expressed in qualitative study from people living with obesity. And they related all these barriers around one concept, that is the identity of the person. So some people identify themselves as being active, so they are physical, such as runners or swimmers. But some other people differentiate themselves, so they don't feel at home in a gym, they don't feel well exercising. So the concept of self, or the concept of identity, is really important, and all the barriers have been related to that. There are 3 sub-themes that were explained here, and these are considering the way people consider their weight, the sense of being able to exercise, and the third one is the sense of belonging. So I'm going to use this study to, as a basis for my talk. So starting with considering weight. Of course, how people consider themselves has a very important effect on their identity and physical activity, and the identity also. So among people living with obesity, the way they see their weight, their actual weight, and also the change in weight affects their motivation and their participation in physical activity. So the way they see their weight can have a positive or a negative effect on their physical activity behavior. Either to start being active or to pursue physical activity, it has an important effect. And it was really often cited as the main motivation to be active. And this is actually sad, because we know all the benefits of being active. It goes far beyond just weight loss, as it has been presented earlier. We have healthy obese individual. If they exercise, it will increase their health. So, but in the in the qualitative studies, people living with obesity would relate their practice, their exercise, to weight loss. That was the main motivation and the main reason really often cited. We see here that in a survey, people were asked how do they consider themselves. Like, if I was to ask you, do you consider yourself to be acceptable weight, unhealthy, or overweight? That was the question people had to answer. And they also had to report their BMI and their height. These two variables were related to the, their likelihood to meet the physical activity recommendation. And what we've seen is that perceived overweight, or their perceived weight, was more detrimental or had decreased their likelihood to be physically active more than their actual BMI in people characterized as overweight. So it's not the weight itself that was considered the barriers, it is how people perceived their weight as being unacceptable. Other than that, people, when they were interviewed, when they talked about weight, either their weight or weight change, it was very negative. So it was a huge, a huge barrier for them, and it was an aspect that could even cancel any benefits that they would perceive during physical activity. And this has been shown not only among adults, but also among adolescents. Those who reported that their reasons to be physically active was one of the main reasons for being active, they were less likely to be active. In another group of adolescents who were constantly or increased their physical activity practice, they didn't even mention weight regulation and body weight management as a reason to exercise. So when weight is seen as the main motivation, it actually decreases the motivation. So for the health professionals, researchers involved with participants living with obesity, for a policymaker, it is important to keep in mind that the weight consideration can be really big barriers and or can be used as a facilitator for physical activity. So program and messaging around physical activity should not focus at all on weight. I know it's difficult in working in clinical, having my clinical work right now, I face a lot of people, the only thing they have in mind is to lose weight. They don't even care about their health. They don't even care about the well-being, improving health, improving sleep. This is not what they have in mind, of course, because there are a lot of messaging around it's important to lose weight. Even health professionals, they would tell, I gave a talk to doctors telling them, stop telling your patients to lose weight. Tell them to be active, tell them, focus on lifestyle, not necessarily on weight. And I have another argument regarding that coming. So, also weight management, weight loss expectation has to be managed also, because of course it's difficult to lose weight. Of course, it is difficult to maintain weight loss after. And people think that it's easy because this is what we see on TV. It's supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be for everybody. And if you don't succeed, it's your fault. But it has to be managed, these expectations. And also, there's no need to put a tag on people. There's no need to say, you're overweight, your BMI classification is this, this, or that. And please avoid morbidly obese, that sort of terms, because as I just said, the identity of a person is really important. The way they consider themselves has a greater impact on their physical activity, more than the tag that they have on the actual BMI. So we don't need to talk about weight. It's funny to say that at the Obesity Summit, but we don't necessarily need to talk about weight. The other aspect, being able to, so I think the I think I can aspect is really important too. Here again, people express either positive or negative experience related to that topic. Weight loss was mentioned as a factor that will increase their sense of being able to. But it's because of the messaging again. It's because we tell them that they have to lose weight. But I was happy to see that when people felt that they improved their skills, it was also seen as a positive experience and a facilitator for change. And the negative experience were around discomfort, pain, injuries. When people were asked in an interview to talk about their barriers to physical activity, the one in yellow are all related to the I think I can aspect. So being capable of, for instance, pain, I don't know how to exercise, there are health concerns that prevent me from exercising, I don't know where, I lack energy, lack motivation, so people do not feel that they are able to. So this has to be addressed. And it was one of the main concerns or the main barriers that were expressed. Of course, injuries this is normally what people will talk about. Like, you don't necessarily have to highlight it that much, but as much as BMI increase, there are more people talking about injuries as being a barrier to physical activity. This has to be addressed. And the way they perceive the exercise also changes with the increase in BMI. In this study, people were asked to perform a certain task up to a certain level of exertion, and what we can see is that the number of METs achieved by people with higher BMI for the same perceived exertion was lower. So related to that, it was suggested that when we prescribe exercise, we do not impose the intensity or the duration of exercise, but we use a Borg scale, like self-imposed intensity. It's much better, not only for the exertion effect, but it has been shown in another study that the pleasure effect is different too, especially in people with higher BMI. They like to have this power to decide when they have enough, actually. So the recommendation regarding to the sense of being capable of, it's provide knowledge on how and where to exercise. It's basic knowledge. This barrier has to be overcome before other barriers could be overcome. And it's good to set an easily achievable goal, like small steps. It's always good also. Sorry. The sense of belonging. Brendon talked a little bit about this. Some people like being laughed at in gyms and stuff like that. It's really sad, but it happens. And these people, they do not like it. It's like, of course people don't like it. Nobody would like to feel left alone. And in gym and physical activity places like gym classes, the sense of belonging was reported as a very strong barrier to physical activity. So, again, oops, I'm going back. Okay. Again, some positive experience were expressed, but there were many people expressed discomfort and feeling ashamed, and this was a main topic. So on the good side, though, some people experienced after an intervention, like a group intervention especially, like experience of good mood, being comfortable, being able to enjoy, being allowed to enjoy, and feeling safe also, and being encouraged. So the group aspect can be either positive or negative. Some people, some of the interviewees talk about, I prefer to go walk, do my stuff alone in my place, but then where's the sense of belonging at that time? And in the group aspect, if the group is welcoming, and if the health professional and the leaders of the group are welcoming, and there's no judgment, no discrimination, this is the biggest part, the biggest point for feeling at home during physical activity. Positive attitude, encouragement is always important too. So for the other life stage that I was to talk about, weight loss, after an important weight loss, we know that physical activity, and it has been just said, that physical activity is an important factor for weight loss maintenance. Not only that, for well-being and for all the other benefits, but for weight loss maintenance, it's really important. We might think that because of the bariatric surgery, people would start to be to be exercising more often, they would enjoy it better, but it's not necessarily the case. Of course, there was a reduction in pain, and maybe the exertion was, the level of the perceived exertion was not the same, but still, some reported some fatigue after the surgery, sorry, the surgery. So the barriers were either motivational. There was like 75% of people like post-bariatric barriers were motivational. There was like 75% of the participants who mentioned one of these motivational barriers, and about 20% reported the physical barriers too. One point that is important to mention is that before the surgery, most of these people saw exercise as a mean or as a way to lose weight. If they haven't changed this mentality after weight loss, what do you think will happen? They don't see the importance of being active because they have lost the weight. So this has to be addressed also after weight loss surgery or weight loss intervention, because that's it. If physical activity is so ingrained or is so related to weight loss, then you lose the reason why you should exercise. It's the reason why I would come back to the fact that messaging and programs around physical activity should not be based on weight loss, but should be based on all the other aspects that we all know is important for health and well-being related to physical activity. Another thing that people might not think about or might not talk about, because people are sometimes shy to talk about that kind of stuff, is the excess skin. So we see here that 45% of these people who went through bariatric surgery, they avoid physical activity because of that reason. So this has to be a question health professionals have to ask. To wrap this up, so these are the three concepts that have to be addressed by, as I said, health professionals, policymakers, and researchers. That is the well-being aspects, the capability of doing the exercise and the belonging with others. Thank you. Oh, and these are the tools you might like. I came across these.
Merci, Joanne, pour cette excellente présentation. Thank you very much for your great speech. Any question, comment? GP?
Merci beaucoup, Joanne. Very good talk. In your presentation, you talked more about the barriers to physical activity at the individual level. So we know there's many other barriers for the environment. We want people to make the environment more conducive to physical activity and so on and so forth. So how much of this is interconnected? So we have people working in clinic to try to remove the barriers at the individual level, public health folks trying to make the environment more conducive. We still work a bit in silos, and we hope that at the end of the day, all of the pieces of the puzzle, everyone is going to be active and happy. So how much of this should be more integrated or not, or linked?
Yeah, in the ideal world, we would all not take our car and be able to walk to work, and everybody would be able to do it because they had the perfect brought up, parents were active, and it's difficult to. I think action has to be taken at every level, of course. And in my practice, I cannot ask someone to move if their neighborhood is not the perfect neighborhood. I can bring this point up, but their environment has to be modified. That's a really broad question, actually. I think that action has to be, but the best thing is that people at every level, they talk to each other so that one action is consistent with the action of another. But yeah, everybody has to work hand in hand to make physical activity easier, or the default for everybody. Yeah.
Any other question? I think I think we have globally a great challenge about your last point when you said that people, we have to demystify the fact that doing physical activity to losing weight, it's not the perfect solution. right now we are revising the chapter for physical activity and weight, and we have to be conscious that the average weight loss over a year through physical activity is about 2 kilos. So it's not a real tool, but it's a challenge to deal with the patients, because it's really believed that physical activity, as you mentioned, as the city showed, that is the main reason why they started. So we have to switch their mind during the course of their initiation and in the follow-up, and to link with Michael Vallis' workshop the other day. That's where the provider needs to coach and follow up the patients to try to move it from the motivation of weight loss to motivation to enjoy physical activity. And in my practice, one thing I try to do with the patients is try to make them take a time after they do their exercise session, how they feel, more relaxed, how their day was the day they exercise. They sleep better, they are more calm with their kids and all that. So to take the time to see the benefit of doing the exercise beside the weight loss. So thank you for reminding that this is an important, I think, public message that we have to go around. So thank you for assistance to this physical activity review. I thanks our speaker. Thank you.